I can do a 2-minute pitch. Okay.
Offensive and writing for questions, you know, I think they read blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Understand why you're wrong about stuff. And because it is, we share where it is.
Okay, everybody, welcome to this special Mansueto Colloquium. So what we want to do today is have a series of lightning talks. You're gonna get 3 talks in roughly an hour, and we want to do this to introduce to you our 3 new postdoctoral fellows in the Mansueto program. So we have 2, hopefully, you all get a chance to know our fellows over time. We have 2 returning fellows, Laura and Evelyn, who's here, and we have 3 new fellows. And so this is just to give you a chance to see who's incoming to the community, what kind of work do they do, maybe you'd like to connect with them afterwards and get to know them better. So I think what I'll do is just go ahead and introduce all 3 of them and then let them just blow through their talks. What we're going to do is ask you to hold your questions till the end, and clarifying questions are fine during the talk, but otherwise if you hold them to the end, just so we make sure everyone gets their allotted period of time. So our 3 postdocs. First, we have Victoria Mooers, who is here joining us from having gotten her PhD at Columbia. She's an economist who works in political economy, and she's doing a postdoc jointly with Mansueto and Harris School with Professor Anthony Fowler. And our second speaker is going to be Jonathan Tollefson. Jonathan is a sociologist who is joining us from Brown, and Jonathan is here jointly with the sociology department, Professor Jeff Woodkey, who is here. And just a quick pitch, Jonathan is going to be giving a practice job talk next week on Monday. So if you like the teaser that he's going to give you today in his 15-minute increment, come for the full deal next Monday. We'll send more information about that. This is a recent addition to our schedule because he just got invited for a job talk. So look forward to that. And then finally, we have Camilla Schneider, who is joining us right here from UChicago from the Econ department, and her faculty advisor in the Econ department is Eric, who I think most of you probably know. And well, I've said enough. They're going to, in a quick succession, give you 3 talks. First, we'll have Victoria.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our talks today. So I'm Victoria Mooers, and today I'll be talking to you about social networks and voter information. Before I dive in on that paper, I just wanted to kind of highlight my interest broadly in some other projects I have ongoing right now. So I'm very interested in social networks and how they affect the spread of information and who becomes informed, and in particular, the consequences of this for political participation and decision-making. A few other projects I have in this area. So I'm currently working on a project about liquid democracy, which is a voting system that proponents describe as kind of the golden medium between direct democracy and representative democracy, because like direct democracy, you're allowed to vote yourself on every single issue, but you're also allowed to delegate your vote to a person of your choice. So very flexible representative democracy. I also have a theoretical paper on underrepresentation, where we basically show that if you have role model effects, even if you shut down all other channels for underrepresentation, role model effects makes it very persistent into the long term. And with Chris and Camilla, we're starting a new project on the return to nightlife after the pandemic. So stay tuned. Hopefully we'll have more on that soon. But today we'll talk about social networks and voter information. So in the US, political boundaries are redrawn quite often. And in particular, congressional district boundaries are redrawn at least once every 10 years. But there are very few rules governing how these boundaries are drawn. And really the strictest rule is just that they need to have roughly equal populations. So this great freedom in how you can draw districts has spawned a really large literature studying redistricting, studying everything from the consequences of redistricting to the optimal way to draw district boundaries to strategic partisan redistricting, or also known as gerrymandering. But one thing this literature hasn't considered is whether it matters who's drawn into the same district as you, whether your friends are also in your district, whether your district actually matches your social network. So why do I think that might matter? Well, we know that how information spreads in social networks is really important for a variety of outcomes. So the structure of a social network determines who becomes informed. One example is this Arias et al. Paper shows that if a friend of my friend loses their job, I become more likely to be pessimistic about the national economy. So one aspect of the structure of social networks that might matter is whether my social ties or my friends are actually voting in the same election as me. So you can imagine if this is a district boundary and I live over here in District A, but my friends are all over here in District B, then if my friends are ever talking about any representative at all, they're probably most likely to be talking about their own representative, the representative of District B. But then when I go over to vote in District A, I'm just going to be that much less informed about my representative because I wasn't hearing anything about them from my friends. So that's kind of the idea I have here today. And this is important because we know that informed voters are very important for government monitoring, holding the government to account. And we also know that informed voters receive more public spending. The underlying idea being that if I'm a representative, I want to target my efforts towards the people who are actually paying attention and will reward me for that. So I'm going to start today with an example to help kind of fix ideas. So in my project, I'm using data from all 48 states, contiguous 48 states. But for this example, we'll focus on Ohio. So this is a map of the US state of Ohio, and the thin boundaries are county boundaries, and the thick boundaries are congressional district boundaries. And what this map is basically plotting is the topography of the social network for this county highlighted in blue, which is called Hocking County. So the idea is in the dark red counties, that's where a lot of Hocking's friends live. And in the light yellow counties, Hocking County has fewer friends. The data underlying this is the Facebook Social Connectedness Index, which is the main data I use in this project, which gives the relative probability of friendship between counties. So we can talk about that more in the Q&A if you're interested. But under this congressional district map, we can see that the congressional district Hocking is in really circumscribes the core of Hocking's social network. So if you're living in this county, then under this map, a lot of your friends are going to be in the same district as you. But then consider if we go to a different congressional district map. So now under this map, the congressional district border runs along Hocking's northern and eastern edges. And so it essentially bisects Hocking's social network. So now you can imagine if I'm a person living in Hocking County going about my day, then probably about, say, a little less than half of the people I run into are in my congressional district, but also a little less than half are over here in this other congressional district. So under this map, Hocking County would have a lower share of their friends in the same district as them. So those are the kinds of differences that I'm thinking about in this project. And so the first thing I do here is I construct a measure of this match between social networks and congressional districts. And the measure I construct, I'm going to call it district homophily just to give it a name, but it's a very simple measure. It's just for the average person in a county, what share of their friends live in the same district. You can also think of this as if I choose a random person from a county and a random one of their friends, what's the probability that those two people live in the same district? So obviously this measure is going to be correlated with a lot of things. There are a lot of things that are associated with both social networks and how congressional districts are drawn. So one really obvious one is that urban areas will tend to have lower district homophily, not only because the density means you have to draw congressional districts much smaller, but also because urban areas tend to have much more spread out social networks because they have stronger ties to other urban areas, even if they're really far away. So in order to get some plausibly causal identification, I'm going to use an event study design, and I'm going to use as a treatment here the changes in this district homophily measure that occur due to redistricting. And I'm focused on the redistricting happening ahead of the 2012 election. So did you get an increase or a decrease in the share of friends in your district? How big was it? And I find that these changes are largely uncorrelated with observables. So then I can use this design to estimate the effect of this match between social networks and districts on things like how informed voters are about their House representatives, voter turnout in House elections, and campaign contributions to House candidates. Then in the second part of this project, what I do is I write down a model of the spread of political information through social networks within districts. And then I can use that model to simulate outcomes under different congressional district maps. So the idea here is that you can give me a set of maps, and I can rank these maps based on how informed they make voters on average overall. And I can also compare how different groups of voters would be affected. So are voters in Democratic leaning counties more likely to be informed under this map as opposed to another map? Things like this. And the reason I do this is in a lot of the literature on gerrymandering so far, for the most part, you basically assume that however I draw the district map, it's not going to change the behavior of someone living in the district. So if I have like a 75% probability of turning out to vote, it doesn't matter who else is in the district with me. I have that probability. But what my results show is that I find that if you have more of your friends in your district, you are more likely to vote in the House election. So it does matter who else is in your district with you. So the idea is, in future research, we can move towards thinking about how we can incorporate this and thinking about how fair congressional district maps are. So I have a little time that I can go into some of my main results a bit more. So first we'll talk about these impacts on how informed voters are. So to measure this, I use a nationally representative survey in which the survey respondents are shown the name of their House representative, and they're asked to please indicate whether you've heard of this person, and if so, which party he or she is affiliated with. So this will let me get at a really basic measure of whether you're informed in the sense of, do you even recognize your House representative's name, and do you know correctly what party they belong to? And so here's my event study figures. So this vertical line is just marking the last survey that's asking about the representative who was elected under the old congressional district boundaries. And the y-axis is just showing the change in the share of people who would have said they heard of their incumbent if you had a 0 to 1 change in my measure. And so basically you see that if you get an increase in the share of friends living in your district, you become more likely to have heard of your incumbent. And then similarly, you become more likely to select the correct party for your incumbent. And then turning to voter turnout. So here I use actual county level vote counts. And the measure I'm going to focus on here is House turnout relative to top of ticket turnout. So I do this because this helps me control for anything else that might be pushing around turnout due to the top of ticket election, like a president election or a senator or governor election. So how you can think of this is these are the people who showed up to vote in the top of ticket election. They paid the cost of voting, but then they skipped the down ballot House election. This is also called roll-off, if you've heard of that. And this also, I also look at this measure because you can think of that maybe information could drive this behavior. One reason I might roll off might be that I don't recognize the names of either of the candidates. So what we find is that if you have an increase in the share of friends living in your district, you experience a decrease in this abstention rate, or essentially among people who are turning out to vote in the top of ticket election, an increase in the share who are voting in the House election. So the roll-off rate on average is about 4.4%. So this would say that if you had a 10 percentage point increase in the share of friends in your district, you'll have a 10% decrease in this roll-off rate. Then turning to the campaign contributions. So I use just the FEC campaign contribution data, and I look at individual contributions to House candidates. And I can see if the contributions are going to candidates that live in the same district as a contributor or in a different House district. So the measure I'm going to focus on here is the share of contributions people are giving to the candidates running in their own district, as opposed to candidates running outside of their district. So on average, people give about 50% of their contributions to people in their own district. So what we find here is, again, if you have an increase in the share of friends living in your district, you have an increase in the share of your contributions you're giving to candidates running in your own district. So this would mean if you have about a 10 percentage point increase in the share of friends in your district, you'll be shifting 15% of your contributions towards candidates running in your own district, away from the candidates running outside of your district. So this is just a summary of those results, and some of the main things I wanted to point out is just, you know, the effects on how what share of people are informed about their representative might seem kind of small. Like, for example, we're just moving from 93% of people have already heard of their representative in the mean. So this is only about 1% increase over that if you have a 10 percentage point increase in the share of friends in your district. But when we compare this to some other studies, there's a study on how much local newspapers make people more informed about their representative. This would be equivalent to the effect of a 15% increase in the number of newspaper articles published about your representative. And that effect on abstention from a 10 percentage point increase in the share of friends in your district is equivalent to a 50% increase in the number of newspaper articles published about it. So just to summarize, I find that voters who live in districts that are better aligned with their social networks are more likely to be informed in this very basic sense about their House representatives, to vote in House elections, and to donate to the candidates running in their own districts. So this suggests that drawing these district borders to better map communities could help make voters more informed and maybe participate more. So in future research, I want to think more about how we can account for this when we're assessing gerrymandering and which maps are drawn fairly. And one last thing I want to point out is that almost all of the data I used in this project was publicly available. So you can go and access all of it right now. So on the one hand, hopefully that means that policymakers could use this to better assess the fairness of districts. But also, as you see in a lot of gerrymandering research, once something that people are using to gerrymander is uncovered, we find out that it's been being used for a very, very long time. So hopefully we can try to get out ahead of this. So thank you all so much.
Probably hear me with this. So yeah, all right. That was wonderful. Great to see everyone. Thanks for coming out. So yeah, I'm Jonathan Tollefson, finished up a PhD at Brown over the summer. Arrived here about 8 weeks ago. And so to talk about what I've been working on. Yeah, so really kind of broadly speaking, my work is about how society environment relations shape inequality. And I've kind of outlined some of what that work looks like and then talk about kind of a specific project I've been working on for a number of years. And I just got over a cold in so many places, not quite as vibrant as it usually is. But yeah, so kind of the first area that I work in, this is kind of where I'll be going with the talk, is about kind of the environmental dimensions of urban inequality. And the project yeah, so it's, I've spent a long time kind of working with research groups in the Providence area about some specific social environmental practices happening there, spatially, longitudinally. And what we'll be talking about today is mostly kind of a longer historical project that's in that realm, comparative across a number of cities across the US. A second area that's related, I swear it's related, although it sounds very different, focuses on how cities and communities kind of understand and plan for climate resilience and adaptation. And as part of that work, I've been working with the Community Resilience Group at the NIST Engineering Laboratory, understanding kind of the evolution of community resilience research at the interface between kind of resilience research and policy, focusing on some sort of fun network analysis, text analysis techniques. The third area is really around thinking about critically about data and computation, thinking about how data shapes governance, and academic research is informed by approaches from kind of SDS, like sociology of knowledge, and particularly thinking about kind of computational environmental science and technology studies. So it's kind of the broad, three very broad areas, but so we're going to talk about one of those at the moment. And that's a project that is about understanding the role of social environmental processes in the formation of segregated neighborhoods in US cities, kind of in this long historical context. Something that's been studied pretty extensively in the environmental inequality literature, but there's some big limitations in how that literature deals with this theoretically and substantively. Right, so quantitative, we know that quantitative work on the environmental risk really took off in the 1980s with the rise of the environmental justice movement. And we have a lot of evidence since then that environmental risk and exposure are associated with kind of racial and economic marginalization and how that manifests in space. As that sort of research program expanded since the 1980s, it's relied really heavily on EPA and other regulatory data. And that regulatory data is only really available going back to the environmental regulatory state in the late 70s and early 80s. So we have this sort of post-1980 focus of quantitative work on urban environments and urban environmental risk. And that means that sort of this research on kind of the environmental dimensions of urban inequality are really dealing with a particular moment in the social history of the cities. So that moment is kind of the rise and like slow decline of neighborhood scale racial segregation. So this kind of body of research developed that is really dealing with a point in the history of the cities when racial segregation is really kind of ingrained into urban space. And this means that, well, it means a number of things, but it means that kind of theories of this relationship between social and environmental marginalization end up being kind of based on a limited case universe with kind of specific understanding of how cities are organized. That kind of social history of cities is an interesting place to begin. In the late 1800s, right? So residents of US cities lived in deeply kind of segregated spaces, but that was organized in a relatively small spatial scale, street by street, household by household. Very, across cases, that was a broad pattern that we see in that period. Those socio-spatial patterns started to scale up in the early 1900s, and it really took into the 30s and 40s for the neighborhoods and segregation to emerge as this organizational structure for urban inequality in the US. And that's also when we have this a massive wave of urbanization across the US. So these socio-spatial structures that characterize US urban inequality really emerged in the late 19th and late 20th centuries, solidified up through the 70s. There's a couple consequences of this temporal theoretical problem. Not to be too kind of aggressive about it, but there's an argument to me that urban sociologists kind of risk treating environmental processes as a set of outcomes that are overly atop this patchwork of unequal neighborhoods. That contributes to what Kevin Lochran's called urban sociology sort of limited collective advance from a deep and sustained environmental consciousness. This sort of like methodological and historical problem that contributes to a theoretical division between urban and environmental sociology, which is where my work is aimed at. And I deal with this kind of by attacking the data problem and then working backwards to that theoretical question. And with that in mind, I developed a computational approach to extract kind of a particularly important source of environmental risk and environmental pollution, kind of point sources of environmental pollution during this really theoretically generative period in late 19th and early 20th century states. I'll talk about that case for a moment because it's kind of interesting. And the case that I'm working with is the manufactured gas industry or the coal gas industry. This is basically the first kind of urban fossil fuel utility. It's an emblematic feature of industrializing cities in that period. It involved burning enormous amounts of coal to generate gas that was delivered to homes and businesses through pipeline networks that were later repurposed for natural gas starting in the 50s and 60s, depending on where you were. And that coal gas was used to light streets and to heat homes and to power industrial machinery. And the gasworks that produced that form of urban energy, they were massive, right? They took up multiple city blocks. They were kind of centrally located, nestled right into residential neighborhoods. They consumed thousands of pounds of coal every day, operate around the clock, and were kind of understood at the time as these huge sources of environmental risk and air and water pollution. Regulation was basically non-existent. There's a series of court cases that have litigated the water pollution that was emanating from gasworks and destroying fisheries. Drinking water wells were damaged, but the state basically sometimes kind of sought monetary restitution, but the siting of these things was untracked and unregulated. There's no evidence that those sort of local contestations around environmental risk led to any sort of action on the part of the state to limit where gas was produced and sourced. A lot to talk about that. I'm going to move through that real quickly. The industry started to disappear in the 1920s, 1930s, and because it was kind of replaced by natural gas and other forms of energy long before the beginning of the environmental regulatory state, right? It's relatively untracked. The EPA attempted to locate gasworks in US cities in the 1980s and did a pretty decent job, but the kind of engineering side of things, the site investigation people argue that most of the sites that are associated with this particular industry are still lost in history. So it's a great case to kind of understand the evolution of urban and environmental inequality during this formative period in US cities, because of its scale, because it's their sites associated with the industry are defined, and for other reasons. It allows for some interesting comparisons because it's an industry that wasn't subject to local resource economies in the way that something like the chemical industries or steel or metals have a common feature across industries. So to recover this industry, sites associated with this industry from the historical record, I use a computational approach to analyzing fire insurance maps for use by the company. It's a wonderful data source of a lot of public and beautiful as well. So a lot of fun to spend time with. But the Sanborn company produced these incredible building level atlases starting in the late 1800s. For every major city in the US, they were updated pretty regularly, so they provide a picture of urban built environments over this period. But because they're so detailed, so like an atlas of one city might have hundreds, thousands of pages, which were updated every time. So we're doing regional information, which means that kind of computational tools have been really useful for unpacking that particular data source. So that's spending a ton of time. I put together a kind of tool that uses image recognition and some machine learning approaches to locate coal gas sites, this particular source of archival map information. And it does a good job. I won't go into why it does a good job, but it does a good job. Allows me to locate sites that the state has been unable to track, obviously from EPA and state regulatory databases. Then I use the sites that I identify from that methodology to understand the socio-environmental formation of segregated neighborhoods in the late 19th and 20th century. I'm doing that by enriching individual level census data with measures of environmental exposure drawn from that data that I put together. And I'm doing this at a couple different spatial scales, primarily dealing with census enumeration districts to estimate neighborhood level exposure. That's drawing on geospatial data from spatial structures from the social sciences around, and also more granular level, dealing with street segments, so enumeration districts are kind of the smallest scale that we have for population data from that period. We can get kind of creative with integrating kind of spatial and aspatial data, which involves combining kind of enumeration district information with street names to place people on a series of mutually exclusive street segments, and using those street segments to estimate kind of street level exposure to this particular street. And then I'm comparing between 1880 and 1930 for various data reasons. I'm going to capture kind of both ends of this period of transformation. I bring that together through a series of models that predict residential exposure to this particular source of environmental risk at the district level and also street by street. And using occupations as kind of a proxy for class structure, standard set of sociodemographic control variables, and also race and ethnicity comparison that focuses on native-born whites as the reference category, which is problematic. We'll talk about that. Foreign-born white immigrants and racialized non-white residents of those cities in this period. So, dealing with 7 cases based on the limitations in historical data, which are Baltimore, Cleveland, Minneapolis, New Orleans, Oakland, Providence, and San Francisco, which provides some variation in sociodemographic and industrial districts. Very briefly, the site identification process that I use identifies about 60 gasworks sites across these cases, drawing from about 27,000 map images. This is what it looks like in San Francisco. This kind of transformation of environmental geography over this 15-year period. Things change. There's kind of a gradual shift in energy production from the historical kind of core of cities to industrial periphery, and kind of a slow transformation in industrial landscapes. And this is happening at the same time as this kind of massive population. Very briefly, I'll outline the results, focusing on change in the average marginal effect of the key variables I'm interested in on these 2 measures of level exposure, which lets me get a kind of change over time in the social distribution. You don't have to look at the chart too carefully. It's really small and there's a lot of them. But the primary finding, I'm running 6 different models for these 6 different cases dealing with San Francisco and Oakland as a combined case for various reasons, is that I find a really interesting kind of generalized transformation in the social stratification and exposure over this period. The short story is a significant and generalized escalation in environmental exposure among racialized populations across every single set. This is also the only kind of significant generalized change that's consistent across these cases. There's a bunch of variation in how kind of country of origin, occupation, characteristics shape environmental exposure, big variations in how things are organized case by case at the beginning of the study period and at the end, actually. But there's this kind of long-term generalized trajectory in which environmental exposure across cases begins to be a positive, starts to racialize. So yeah, these are dealing with the neighborhood level. These processes are visible at the street level as well, and also if we zoom into individual neighborhoods to look at how environmental risk is reorganized street by street within neighborhoods that are subject to high levels of environmental pollution from domestic processes. This is process is happening kind of across scales and across cases. So this, maybe I'll conclude. So in summary, right, there's this, I'm finding that kind of racial environmental inequality ends up being a much earlier structure than other research has been able to demonstrate, which I think provides some early evidence that the society-environment relations, right, are really embedded in the emergence of these foundational structures of US urban inequality, and how those structures emerged in the early 20th century. You can speak to a number of different things. In particular, there's an interesting link to some of the kind of recent terms of Du Boisian understandings of environmental sociology as well. So Du Bois understood, right, environmental racialization as a political and ideological process of transferring stigma of environmental degradation onto racialized individuals. And with that in mind, some of the findings from this project, I think, make the case for environmental racialization as a sociospatial process. I think about kind of urban spaces as being co-produced with racialization exposure. Yeah, there's implications for how we think about the relationship between environmental justice and policy as well. And probably, oh, great. Yeah, so very briefly, contemporary environmental justice frameworks rely on a couple different things, a kind of a rights-based understanding of the social distribution of risk, a regulatory model of risk management, and we often deal with sort of a post-industrial model of cities. I think that some of the work they're doing raises a question of kind of how we go about theorizing environmental relations in cities before civil rights, before the environmental regulatory state, and before the establishment of some of the geographies, segregated geographies rather. So this argument there that sort of environmental justice policy needs to kind of reckon with the mutual constitution of race and environment and how these are restructured over time. Yeah, there's kind of a link to this Du Boisian term provides us some ways of thinking about that as well. Pete Margouche, who's up at just starting up at Northwestern this fall, argues that Du Bois envisioned kind of a redistributive kind of environmental justice might go a long way towards unmaking kind of racial ideology as well, that if kind of the uneven distribution of environmental resources racialized working people, then the even distribution by the state might start to make kind of undermine some of these processes of racialization. So that's, I think we're all in it, but I guess we'll be talking about this for like an hour on Monday. So some of the sentences will be the same, a lot in the middle of the program as well. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Heidi.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much, Victoria. And today I'm Camila. I'm the third new fellow here. Thanks so much for coming, for attending. Today I'm going to briefly discuss my research. So I guess I would broadly characterize my research into like supply side determinants of food access, hence the title. I'm an IO economist. I focus on urban economics as well. And briefly, I've kind of studied how like competition and market structure change, like where retailers are located, what the food landscape is, whether that's like dollar stores or whether that's like specific contracts between landlords and their retailers. That's sort of what I focus on so far. And then I care about how that affects like every consumer. So today I'm going to talk about what was my job market paper. I'm going to talk about what I'm going to call like exclusive dealing in retail real estate. And what I'm specifically going to talk about are these kind of private agreements called restrictive covenants that are found in leases and deeds. These are private agreements between retailers and their landlords. And what they do is that they tell, the retailer tells the landlord who else the landlord can rent out their property to. So here's an example. This is like a Safeway at a specific intersection in Chicago. And this Safeway is telling their landlord that no other part of the shopping center, which the landlord owns, can be used for a supermarket, a drugstore, a liquor store, or a convenience store. So it kind of gets you thinking, like maybe we only have one grocery store per shopping center because of these sorts of contracts potentially. And so there are kind of three things to notice about this example. The first is that the radius in question is the shopping mall, and it's really about like who we should locate together here. So it's about co-tenancy. The second is that it's listing a broad list of competitors for the Safeway. And the third are all of the stores that tend to be missing from here are the stores that you tend to find at shopping centers like your banks. And these are stores that there might be some value of locating like the grocery store next to the bank so that people can go to these kind of complementary stores on the same trip. And so these are examples of exclusive dealing provisions. There's a long kind of theoretical literature in industrial organization and economics that says like we do not know whether or not these are good or bad, and the results can go either way. So for example, they might be bad, they might be anti-competitive because mechanically these contracts are for closing on entry. That can push out other retailers and that can increase prices and distances that consumers have to go to. But on the other hand, there are kind of two reasons for why they might be good. One reason they might be good is that giving a retailer some level of monopoly profits can encourage entry by limiting competition. And then the second reason it can be good is that giving consumers a variety of stores to shop at nearby might give an easier trip for them, might improve the variety of their trip, and that might outweigh the benefit of having like competing stores located right next to each other. So because the welfare effect, or whether or not this is good or bad, is ambiguous, I am going to study this empirically, and I'm going to study this empirically in the context of Chicago. And so this paper has three parts. Part one is to just establish some descriptive evidence on the prevalence and who is using these sorts of contracts, because no one had studied these before prior to me studying them. And I find that they're super, super prevalent, and that people, that they seem to work. Like stores with these contracts have fewer competitors than stores without these contracts. Then I'm trying to understand how this affects, your consumers, other retailers, and the landlords as well. And so I have a model which is broken down into these three parts: the landlords, the retailers, and the consumers, where the consumers are going to shop, retailers are going to choose locations and contracts, and the landlords are going to offer spots for retailers and their contracts. And then with this model, with this estimates of the model, I'm going to estimate a counterfactual where I'm going to try to understand what the role of these contracts are. I'm going to ban exclusive dealing and try to compare the observed world to the world, the counterfactual world without these exclusive dealing agreements. And basically what I find is the moral of the story is these exclusive dealing agreements are actually preventing food deserts. Option two, where giving some monopoly profits encourages entry, is the margin that kind of ends up winning out. And so these end up being basically good for consumers, for most consumers. Okay, so I'll go, because no one had studied these contracts before, I will show you what the data looks like, and I'll show you some like patterns in the data. So this project basically depends on my ability to write down a model of how retailers choose their locations. And so I basically construct a set of locations the retailers can enter using some private data. I figure out where they actually do enter. I figure out what prices they pay. And then finally, I figure out what other retailers are blocked at that location in that contract. So to get these exclusive dealing restrictions, I scraped the Cook County Recorder Office. I downloaded a bunch of PDFs on like leases and deeds, and that told me information on like the landlord, the tenant, the set of retailers, the radius, the duration, etc. This is the first example that you saw on the slide. They kind of look like this. And from this, I can extract the text that tells me these details of the contracts. Then to understand like how the consumers are shopping, I also use consumer panel data, which tells me like what trips people are going, where they live, what set of retailers they're going to, what they buy, and that tells me the value of shopping at specific stores and the value of shopping at stores together and how much they dislike kind of distances and prices. So now I'll kind of describe some like basic data patterns about these restrictions. The first is that they're super common. As you can see, this is them in Cook County. They've been increasing over time steadily since like 1990, with like a peak in 2019. They peak first in 2005. I think that's like when Walmart enters into Chicago. The second is that they're the types of retailers that use that are like your grocery stores, your drug stores, and your discount stores. So grocery stores, drug stores, and discount stores are all stores that sell like similar products to their direct competitors, where pushing out competitors, even just slightly, might be beneficial for the bottom line. Here I've ranked the top, I think 11. Walgreens is number 1, Jewel Osco, and then in red I have like the percent of rented stores available too. So like your Aldi's, your grocery stores, your big box stores, they're all here. And these are the stores that I end up modeling. Then we can also look inside of the contracts to understand what they're saying. And I find that they're quite heterogeneous. So they both vary across different retailers and within retailer locations. So what this plot is saying is that like all Whole Foods are blocking other grocery stores. Every single Whole Foods tells its landlord, do not rent to another grocery stores. Most of the Jewel Osco are also blocking grocery stores. And then a smaller subset of Whole Foods are blocking kind of pharmacy or liquor type items, but a much larger portion of Jewel Osco is blocking pharmacy or liquor type items. And that's probably because Jewel Osco has a pharmacy inside of it, Whole Food doesn't. So it's about the types of food, the types of items they sell and and the competition for these items. Okay, and then the next question is obviously like, where does it bind? How does it matter? And I find that this primarily matters for the shopping center. So I like to understand the radius, I just read the contracts and found that the majority of like the grocery store and the big box contracts specifically list the shopping center radius. So it's really about like who should be the tenant with me. And then the second way I check this is I can run a regression on like the number of competing stores on whether or not you have this sort of exclusive dealing agreement. Controlling for like your retailer chain, your zip code, and your year. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot this coefficient, which is like the effect of the exclusive dealing on the number of stores in a specific radius, and I'm going to increase the radius. So what I'm going to find is that very nearby for stores with these exclusive dealing contracts have fewer competitors compared to the stores without exclusive dealing contracts. And as we go to the 0.3 to 0.6 mile radius, the direction shifts. So it's almost as though the exclusive dealing contracts pushes their competitors slightly farther away. And as we go very far, there's kind of no difference between the stores with exclusive dealing contracts and the stores without the exclusive dealing contracts. And this 0.3 mile radius ends up being an interesting result because there's two other literatures that also find this 0.3 mile radius when it comes to like shopping spillovers and like stores affecting each other within like store revenues affecting each other within a small radius. So the first is the literature that measures spillovers across different stores. They also find like a 0.2, 0.3 mile radius. And the second literature is a literature on like shopping center externalities, how like large retailers drive demand to small retailers. They also find it to be like within the shopping center as well. So with these descriptives, I then try to understand how these affect the distribution of retailers and consumer shopping patterns. So I'm going to build a model because we've discovered that basically what matters is the shopping center. I model entry into the shopping center. I model a landlord that's offering kind of two contracts to retailers, a contract with an exclusive and a contract without an exclusive. And then the large retailers, you know, your Jewel Osco, chooses where they want to enter and chooses which contract. Then small retailers are going to enter, and finally, consumers are going to shop. So I'm going to model each of these portions, and I'm going to briefly go over the key elements in the model. When it comes to consumer shopping, you can imagine a consumer that like lives here is going to choose where they want to go, and whether they want to go is going to depend on how much they dislike kind of prices, distances, and whether they like shopping at stores together. So for example, if they like shopping at this other food store and the liquor store together, they would make the shortest distance trip here, and then back. And whether or not they're going to make this trip compared to other trips are going to depend on the prices here, the distances that they have to travel here, and how much they value shopping at these stores together. And so with my model, I'm going to estimate exactly those parameters. I'm going to find strong distaste for distances, strong distaste for prices, and the moral of the story of my price and distance parameters says that basically if my prices increase a little bit at the grocery store, I'm not going to switch grocery store unless I have another grocery store within the same shopping center. Then for my complementarity parameters, I'm basically going to find something that reflects the contents of the stores, and that's also kind of reflective of the exclusives I was showing earlier. So for example, this is how much I like shopping at drugstores and Tollefson together, which is basically not at all. And I don't like shopping at Costco or drugs or any store that also has a drugstore inside of it. There isn't much value. Meanwhile, there's like a decent amount of value of shopping at like Aldi and the drugstores together. And so these complementarities or these complementarities give rise to like some motivation to have the exclusive dealing agreement. So then, given how much consumers value shopping at stores together, their distances and their time and their locations, I then go and estimate a model where retailers are going to choose locations and they're going to choose whether or not to have an exclusive dealing agreement. And so this is obviously it's in Chicago. I think of this as a market, and I think of a bunch of like potential locations retailers can enter, and they're going to choose one, and they're going to choose whether or not they want exclusive dealing. Okay, so now let's take a very quick step back. Why would we observe exclusive dealing in the first place, and why do we need it? So why is the landlord even offering this contract? The landlord's going to offer this contract if it can extract more rent to make it profitable, and the retailer is going to pick this contract for like possibly two reasons. The first is because if a large retailer enters and the landlord can't commit to not renting to its competitors, then it might not want to enter at all. So it's kind of like a commitment mechanism. And then the second reason is that potentially there's some misperception between the landlord and the retailer, and so writing a contract can correct for the information asymmetry. So for example, if I am firm, but this is based on an example from the estimates I pulled, if I am firm 2, if I enter into a location, I do not want firm 1 to enter near me. I want to keep firm 1 very far away. However, if I'm firm 1, based on the estimates that I found, I might want to enter near firm 2. And so if firm 2 enters a location first, they might want to write a contract with the landlord to make sure firm 1 doesn't enter. And so this is the motivation, and this is the explanation for why I see exclusive dealing. Then, once I've estimated everything, I'm now going to try to understand what the value of exclusive dealing is for consumers kind of overall. And so I want to run a counterfactual where I ban exclusive dealing. And so landlords are only offering a single price to each retailer. And I'm going to compare the two worlds. So in my 2 seconds left, the main result basically comes from this number 0 here. In the south side of Chicago, in a world with exclusive dealing, there's kind of like a 10% chance that a large retailer will enter somewhere in the south side of Chicago, but that number goes down to 0 in a world without exclusive dealing. And that's basically because the landlord can't commit to not letting a small retailer enter after. So that means that basically firm 1 is like a small dollar store, firm 2 is a grocery store, and without this sort of exclusive assurances, there's no entry whatsoever. And in fact, the winners from exclusive dealing are the large stores, the Costco's, the Walmarts, and the Whole Foods, and the losers are kind of the dollar stores. And then in terms of locations in Chicago. In purple is where exclusive dealing is good. In red is where exclusive dealing is bad. So this is saying that like giving some monopoly profit is good because it encourages entry. This is saying that there's enough profit nearby. So actually we can just let the dollar stores enter nearby, and then people will have shorter distance trips to their stores. Thank you.
We have. I lost track of time. I think we have 20 minutes left. If there's some questions, maybe just ask them and say who you're asking them to. We have 5 minutes left. Okay, good.
Hey, I wish I could come up with sort of a single synthesis question for all of you. Unfortunately, no. My question is for Victoria. Don't we tend to vote the same way as our friends also? And so if we do draw districts that are that keep social groups together, won't those be gerrymandered districts, or at least I guess like safe districts for whoever figures out how to win that social group? They can just keep winning that social group.
Yes, it could be. So, yeah, so like broadly what I'm speaking to here is just, we're thinking about the people who are becoming informed through their friends. So like we talked about the people who aren't even voting in the House election and start voting. So I haven't really looked into exactly like how much this would increase like polarization, say, or like, and it's hard to think about, how to find the district that would like maximize the share of friends in your district. Because there's a lot of research on gerrymandering that's basically like drawing optimal districts in different ways. There's so many possible ways you can draw a district that you can't find the perfect one. So the easiest thing to do is to like take some given maps and compare. So you could say like, well, one of my objectives is that we don't make this like so homogenous or something like that. And then you could like downweight the, learning through your friends there. Yeah.
Or I could project too. Check 1, 2. This is more fun. I have a question about the rental and leasing for the commercial properties. A lot of the time, this is done to protect both the landlord and whoever the tenant is, because most markets, like, you don't want to put 2 Thai restaurants next to each other because, with the number of people in the neighborhood, you really only need 1 Thai restaurant. And it kind of is the same with market penetration and absorption for a pharmacy. And CVS and Walgreens and the like, try to keep away from each other a certain number of miles based upon the density of population, because they want the business or at that location to have enough foot traffic to even survive. So with that in mind, what is the downside you're seeing to those practices? Because when you look at communities of need that are food deserts and pharmacy deserts and things like that, there's basically no limit to what is needed. And I'm not sure exactly how these leases are having a negative effect.
Yeah, basically, I think the answer is I agree with you. Like, I find that they're only a positive effect, especially in the places that have need. In terms of the, and then for the most part, I agree. Like, if the landlord and the retailer are like mostly in agreement and it's mostly beneficial to both of them, that's what I find, and I think that's the case. I think the lease, it definitely does protect the retailer though from like things changing in the future, or for example, like a dollar store coming in after they've rented and saying like, hey, actually I could pay the most rent here. So that's what the main protection is, especially in like the high demand areas. But yeah, I think that's why I find that they're like mostly good. And obviously not a panacea.
And also just for reference, like a lot of the times, if there's a grocery store, all of the other tenants say, if that grocery store leaves, we get to break our lease and leave too. And so it creates this interdependent relationship between anchor tenants.
Yeah. Yeah, so I model that in the model, not as in leasing, but there's like two rents basically for the small tenants. One, if the anchor is there, and one if the anchor like isn't there.
But Camilla, in your result, there are some parts of the city where they are not good.
Yes.
Maybe you can say like a little more about the logic there, which is different.
Yeah, I think it's basically that they like in like kind of West Loop area are places where the landlord and the large tenant like essentially benefit from like the landlord gets like a higher rent from signing this lease, even if in a world where they couldn't commit to signing or like they couldn't have an agreement, you would see like a dollar store trying to enter as soon as like the grocery store enters, and the grocery store could stay and the dollar store could also stay. The landlord wouldn't be able to get the same amount of rent from the grocery store, but in the counterfactual world, then there would be like more different types of retailers nearby.
I had another question about kind of the setting. I kind of was a little surprised at first to it sounds like the large retailers have a lot of like market power in a sense over the landlords. And you know, when we think about tenants and like rent and like housing, we think of it as the other way around. The landlords are the one kind of with market power. And so I'm just curious how that arises. Is that just because there's a limited selection of retailers big enough, or is there because it feels like the landlords in general wouldn't want to sign these contracts, but
Ye-
they seem happy to. So
Yeah, totally. In the world where there's like, say there's only one landlord ever in Chicago, then you wouldn't have to see a contract. They would just pick and they would extract the most amount of rent. I agree with you. Yeah, it's kind of the opposite way in commercial these days. I think in part because we've seen, thanks to the internet, we've seen such a like an exit from the large retailers that like if you're grocery, that's considered to be like very, very stable and a very safe tenant to have. And so they have both some like yeah, I guess they have some market power. Yeah.
All right, well, now we're out of time. So thanks, everyone. Thanks to our speakers. And we got information about Jonathan's talk, which is scheduled for next week, and then hopefully we'll hear again from Phil and Victoria as well before the year is out. But welcome to Mansueto, and thank you all for coming out.